Is that showing up now, the handout? Okay, well, I'm absolutely delighted to contribute to this conference. I think it really does take much further and deepen what Mirko and I were trying to do in our edited volume on the Hellenistic reception of Athenian democracy. We did, I think it's fair to say, focus there more on sort of ideology, rhetoric, culture, the different mechanisms through which knowledge of Athenian democracy was spread in the Hellenistic world, comedy, especially philosophy. And this conference has extended things in a wonderful way by concentrating our attention on the real details of how this works at the institutional level. And it's in that spirit that I chose my the topic of my paper for today, because as Paschalis mentioned, I'm mainly working now on a project on the interconnected development of Greek political thought and civic rhetoric in the very late Hellenistic period in interaction with Roman models, as attested across epigraphic and literary and philosophical texts. There, I'm particularly interested in the role of the peripatetics as the Hellenistic school who remained committed, unlike the Stoics and the Epicureans and so on, to the idea that the polis really is the framework for a good human life. So I've been interested to hear lots of the papers already. The peripatetics have come up in their early Hellenistic guise. I think too in the late Hellenistic period, you have this interesting paradox of these peripatetic philosophers who are skeptical or at least ambivalent about democracy, playing a very crucial role in the spread of what's presented as a democratic civic culture. So that's the thread I've been tracing through lots of different papers in this conference, which will be worth returning to. But as I said, for my paper today, I want to concentrate on something more strictly institutional, because of the particular focus of this conference, including the reference to the judicial sphere in the title. So I thought I could contribute best by returning to my earlier research on reconciliation after stasis, but through a new lens prompted by this conference. So this question of Athenocentrism or lack of Athenocentrism in the ways that 4th century and early Hellenistic communities tried to forge bipartisan consensus and reconciliation after an episode of stasis or unrest. The Athenian reconciliation and amnesty of 403 certainly did, in the course of time, become canonical as the best example of how to deal with conflict, but also as a key example of the moderation at the heart of Athenian democratic life. Plutarch, for example, in text 1 on my handout, holds up the Athenian amnesty as the kind of historical example, of gentle moderation to which civic orators should appeal in his day in Roman imperial Greece, instead of obsessing with examples of Athenian military might and military success. And Plutarch's eulogizing of the Athenian amnesty had parallels in idealizing Roman treatments. For example, it's interesting that Cicero starts the Philippics with a reference to the Athenian amnesty as a paradigm. And clearly this eulogizing approach has obviously had a very long afterlife after antiquity, right up to modern treatments. But my focus in this paper is the more immediate and medium-term reception of the Athenian reconciliation. So my question is, was it already held up in the 4th and early 3rd centuries BC as a crucial example of how to achieve stability and consensus after a severe stasis? It would be easy to be misled by the later tradition from Plutarch onwards into overemphasizing how unusual and innovative the Athenian settlement of 403 was at the time. It's true that both before and after 403, a more common type of post-stasis settlement seems to have been a more partisan mode in which the victorious faction exiled or at least marginalized their opponents and imposed their own vision of civic life and institutions. However, there was already a rich tradition before 403 of aspirations and practical moves towards more consensual, inclusive reconciliation after stasis, which preserved the power and the honor of members of all factions involved, normally 2 factions. I thought, for example, of the interesting chapter by Simon Hornblower on the bibliography where he discusses the role of lyric poetry as itself an instrument of bipartisan reconciliation in some cities. That older, wider pan-Hellenic tradition must have fed into the Athenian settlement itself, and it must also have had its own independent influence on the examples after 403 outside Athens. So I'm faced in this paper, like lots of the contributors, with the methodological problem of how to do justice to the influence of archaic and classical political models from outside Athens, which are not attested at all, or much less well attested than the Athenian ones. In my particular case, another serious methodological problem is that our knowledge of the details of the Athenian reconciliation itself is, of course, highly imperfect. We've got, of course, very rich evidence for its reception within Athens. I'm going to be talking mainly about reception outside Athens, but we know, of course, from the orators, from Xenophon, from the Athenocentrism, about this very vigorous debate about how the amnesty related to questions of democracy, justice, homonoia, Athenian exceptionalism, and so on. And inevitably that very rich, very contested reception within Athenian discourse of the settlement of 403 resulted in competing accounts of the details of the settlement in these different orators in Xenophon and in the Athenocentrism. I've given you under 2 and 3 on the handout quite a lot of Xenophon and pseudo-Aristotle's account. I'm not going to talk about this in detail. This is mainly just for reference, to remind everyone. I might come back to some details in these long extracts later on, but the main extracts I'm going to talk about are the ones from the inscriptions, which start under number 4. There are, of course, concerning the Athenian amnesty, fundamental uncertainties which are impossible to resolve with our evidence. For example, was there one single Athenian settlement, as the Athenocentrism has it, or were there rather 2 stages, as Xenophon implies? Another fundamental uncertainty that's been brought out well recently is the question of the meaning in different contexts, formal documentary contexts or literary texts, of the central pledge Mnersi Kakein, which is brought out in the recent debates between Karawan and Joyce and many others. But despite those problems, I hope it's possible to sketch quickly certain features of the Athenian settlement of 403 on which most ancient and modern accounts would agree. First of all, a leading role was played, at least in the initial stages of the settlement, by King Pausanias of Sparta and by the conciliators who came from Sparta to help him, 15 of them according to Xenophon, 10 according to the Athenocentrism. Second, and most importantly, the Athenian settlement, whether in 1 or 2 parts, was based on the principle of moving on decisively from stasis and division by concentrating on re-establishing a durable, inclusive democracy for the future, with a place for supporters of both main factions, so the city-based oligarchs and the demos in exile and under Thrasybulus. Third feature of the Athenian settlement that I would emphasize is that the exiled democrats were to be allowed to return to their citizenship and their property as if nothing had happened. And fourth, a key pillar of the settlement, whether or not it was an automatic implication of the pledge Mnersi Kakein, which is still much debated, was a ban on bringing almost any prosecutions concerning events of the stasis, though it's true that the leading oligarchs themselves had to pass a scrutiny in order to qualify for this and for the other protections of the settlement. And this amnesty, of course, originated partly in the self-interest of King Pausanias and the Spartans in defending the pro-Spartan oligarchic sympathizers from reprisals, but it was also justified at the time in more idealistic terms, and it took on, of course, a life of its own as a symbol of forward-looking and mild reconciliation. So what I'd now like to do is to try and trace whether we can find signs of direct influence of the spirit and details of the Athenian settlement along the lines that I was just talking about in the evidence for bipartisan reconciliation outside Athens in the 4th century and early Hellenistic period. And I'm going to focus on 2 extensive, quite recently published bipartisan 4th century reconciliation agreements, on both of which there are experts present, The first one from Dicaea in Halkidiki. These are the extracts under 4 on the handout, and the second one from the island of Telos in the southeastern Aegean. There's some extracts from that under 5 on the handout. I'll also compare with some other relevant examples, which I tried to collect as clearly as possible on the later parts of the handout, number 6 and number 9, but I won't cover those in detail, I'll just mention some parallels and so on. And the core of my argument is that my 2 main examples, the one from Dicaea and the one from Telos, point in different directions on this question of Athenian influence. It's for the Dicaeopolitan reconciliation, number 4 on the handout, that the strongest case can be made for Athenian influence. This text dates to the reign of Perdiccas III of Macedon, so 365 to 359 BC. And Professor Voutiras, to whom we're much indebted for editing and elucidating this document, has made a very strong case, which I know he's still working on, for the extent of Athenian influence on this settlement. I think it's fair to say he sees it as an attempt to implement the basic structure of the Athenian reconciliation in the quite different context of this very much smaller polis in the North Aegean. I agree that there are very strong signs of the influence of the Athenian model, and I think they're very interesting and striking for this conference. But I'm also going to emphasize some divergence from the Athenian model, reflecting local circumstances, local priorities, local ideology. Now, the city of Dicaea was a probably 5th century BC foundation by Eretrians, perhaps exiles from Eretria, who very pointedly chose the name Dicaea. They were calling themselves the just city to contrast themselves with an expelling regime at home, which was not so just to their mind. But even this city of justice itself fell victim to stasis and exilings on quite a severe scale in the 4th century, at the time of our text. The context of the conflict is not clear, though others have pointed out that the pledge in the oath not to admit Xenoi, perhaps mercenaries, and also the presence of a Macedonian name alongside mainly Eretrian ones, suggest possible dynamics of conflict. It's much easier to reconstruct from the inscription the terms of the reconciliation at Dicaea. So I'll pick out the ways, so first of all, I'll pick out the ways in which the details at Dicaea suggest the inspiration of the Athenian settlement of 403, running through the 4 main elements of the Athenian settlement that I talked about earlier. First of all, the Dicaeopolitan settlement is guaranteed by King Perdiccas and brokered by a certain Lykios and fellow Synalactae. This is all under 4a on the handout. I tried to put in bold the most relevant parts. It's an open question who exactly Lykios and these conciliators were, whether they were Dicaeopolitan citizens or outsiders, but on balance, the prominence of the Macedonian king and the need to pass a decision right at the start of the text to give Lykios special authority, to make him Kyrios in the assembly, this is in 4a, supports the view that he and the other conciliators were perhaps Macedonian representatives of the king. And if that's correct, it would be easy to see the procedure here as inspired, at least to some extent, by the role of King Pausanias of Sparta and the Spartan conciliators at Athens in 403. So you would have an outsider king and outsider conciliators, probably themselves aligned with one of the 2 factions taking charge of the reconciliation. The second point of similarity with Athens is that the Dicaeopolitan settlement, like the Athenian one, was designed to move on decisively from discord and to re-establish a durable, inclusive democracy with a place for both of the 2 main factions, both the exiles with Demarchos and those who'd stayed at home with Xenophon. This is under 4b, which I'll come back to, but you see